Legal aspects. I charge the United States military with violating federal law. The Violence Against Women Act, Title III, Sexual Assault Prevention section, by negligently exposing women to the danger of being raped if captured. Unbelievably, the U.S. can be perceived as providing women as sex partners to our nation's enemies' soldiers. Also, by volunteering for combat support positions, Jessica Lynch and other female volunteers reveal their casual attitude about the possibility of being raped. In accord with them was Major Rhonda Cornum, the POW from the Gulf War, who stated about being, quote, violated manually, vaginally, and rectally, that it should be considered no big deal, an occupational hazard of women going to war. Additionally, feminist politicians who advocate for women in combat must consider women soldiers being raped by their captors acceptable collateral damage, and therefore are guilty of reducing the cultural seriousness of rape. It makes you wonder if rape shield laws, which conceal a woman's past sexual history in our courts, are really necessary anymore with these women's flippant attitudes. Blatant double standards. Women now have cafeteria equality. They can actually pick and choose in what areas they wish to be considered equal. For instance, they can now volunteer for over 90% of military jobs demanding equal access. Yet they still have draft registration exemption, the Violence Against Women Act, sexual harassment law, and domestic violence law as essentially women-only protections. U.S. Code Title X, which kept women out of combat roles, was the reason Congress used to exempt women from the draft. This exemption should be repealed, because women now demand equal access to combat and combat support roles. There can be no legal defense for shielding women and not men from the draft and mandatory combat if women insist on the choice of combat. This Marine World War I poster was used for men only enlistment obligation. Pretty uniformed women were used to entice or embarrass the men into joining. If America feels that women like Jessica Lynch and Captain Linda Bray should be in combat, and since women are still eligible for affirmative action programs because of past discrimination, then female draft registration should start immediately for women who have been denied the opportunity of military service. After all, men have had this privilege to themselves for far too long. Women should be drafted, dropping out totally or just delaying their educations and careers as men have. If our country isn't at war, they can perform civic duties like watching over our borders, keeping our streets and highways clean, or helping the homeless. This is an actual poster put out by the Selective Service System mocking men only for not registering. Importance of priorities. Normally, soldiers consider it a tactically urgent situation or too much trouble detaining POWs. That is why, if this war's outcome was more uncertain and the Iraqis thought they had a chance of winning, most American POWs would have been killed. Only the valuable POWs would be spared. American military officers and women soldiers would be worth holding onto as bargaining chips in case their captors got surrounded or eventually surrendered. There simply is no compelling need for or reason to put women in this dangerous dilemma just to satisfy some feminist equal opportunity quota. Male POWs, female hostages. The folly of co-ed combat. where captured female soldiers can be held as hostages by the enemy, forcing American soldiers to change their battlefield tactics to rescue them is irrational and dangerous. Women as hostages has long been a clever ploy by criminals, terrorists, and now possibly enemy soldiers. In the 9/11 hijackings, the terrorists gained access to the cockpits by abusing and cutting the throats of female stewardesses. The pilots gave in rather than hear the women's screams. All passengers and crew were lost because of this vulnerability. And yet our military is voluntarily sending women into these situations where American men, because of residual chivalry, will try unorthodox rescues, putting their unit in greater jeopardy. An Air Force POW training program actually tried to address the problem of men overly protecting women by training male pilots to ignore the pain and suffering of female pilots as potential prisoners of war. Even Israel eventually removed women from combat roles because when numerous women were killed during a battle, it sent too many Israeli citizens, and especially female members, into shock. Rush Limbaugh's insulting remarks. Mr. Limbaugh states that women's groups passed up praising Jessica Lynch's reportedly heroic fighting story because of who she was, a West Virginia country girl. Wrong, Rush. The feminists didn't praise her because her accidental capture, uncorroborated heroism story, and rescue by an all-male special ops team was nothing to brag about. All it shows is a woman not knowing where she was driving, possibly lying about how she was captured, and dependent on men or the government for her safety as per usual. In response to Rush Limbaugh's insults to men who dared question Jessica's combat role as being members of the 2-inch crowd, I refer him to his own book, The Way Things Ought to Be, page 200. Quote, "Frankly, I don't believe that women should be in combat roles even if they can do the job. And I just don't think we have to subject women to the horrors and rigors of war." Is Mr. Limbaugh a 2-inch crowd member himself, intimidated by tough women? Or just a man expressing a very practical viewpoint as his callers tried to do? And because his callers showed more courage than him in voicing an unpopular opinion, I bet any one of them would be able to satisfy his woman better than he can. Unfit for duty. When a male soldier is not ready for duty because of being too drunk, sunburned, or unprepared in another way, he can be given an Article 15 of court-martial law as punishment. Yet women can voluntarily get pregnant, be excused from duty, sent back home, and given time off without penalty. The high pregnancy rate aboard Navy ships, female soldiers getting pregnant just before they're deployed overseas, and the high pregnancy rate in Bosnia, so female soldiers could go home, makes their military readiness a real joke. Remember the USS Acadia, which was quickly dubbed the Love Boat, during the Gulf War, that had to deactivate because 25% of the women on board got pregnant. Woman as warrior myth. If women were serious about joining men in the violence of war, they should first relinquish their sanctuaries of segregated schools, health clubs, and sports categories. If women are tough enough for combat duty, why are all these women-battered shelters, rape crisis shelters, and sexual harassment lectures necessary? Don't all these protections prove a contradiction? Bucking biology. Thwarting untidy menstruation, inconvenient method of urination, exploitative romantic fraternization, And preferential treatment for telltale pregnancies make women in a combat zone much more of a liability than an asset. In conclusion, considering all the drawbacks of co-ed combat mentioned, especially the permitted engagement of sexual relations between soldiers, it seems the only practical reason for having women in a combat zone is to sexually satisfy our men during a lull in the action. As with any MensNet program, if you would like to comment, send your response by any of the following methods. For more on this subject, refer to Brian Mitchell's Women in the Military. I'm Anthony Nazzaro saying thanks for watching MensNet and good night.